Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth session of the Darkwater Project's 2022 Colloquium, Historical American Art, Whiteness, and the Idea of the American Nation. This week, we will be talking about Matthew Frye Jacobson's book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants in the Alchemy of Race, which was published in 1998. A couple reminders before we get started. I will be reading many or most of the slides that I present. I know that for the live audience, that is sometimes a little bit frustrating. About 7 to 15 times as many people are watching this on YouTube as live, and about 75 to 100 times as many are listening to the audio-only version on via the Modern Art Notes podcast feed, which means that those audio-only folks cannot see the slides. Here's a quick outline of where we're going today. We'll start with where Jacobson starts, the writing of the US Constitution and Congress's response to it once the first United States Congress is formed and active under the new Constitution, the Constitution that we still live under. We'll talk about how Jacobson really emphasizes how whiteness was constructed by drawing lines around rather than within Europe. The importance of skin tone to American political and legal constructions, and the way sculpture has been used in public space to argue for the privileges of whiteness, and the way sculpture has been used in public space to maintain an originalist definition of whiteness and American citizenship. My name is Tyler Green. I'm the author of 2 books. The one on the left is a biography of Carlton Watkins, the most influential artist of the American 19th century. It was published in 2018 by University of California Press. On the right, my whiteness studies informed look at Emerson's 1836 book, Nature, in which I talk about how Emerson was motivated to write nature through his study of art, and how nature, in fact, informed the next 100 years of American art. It was published last year by Random House's Prestel imprint. I'm also the producer and host of the Modern Art Notes podcast, which begins its 12th year next week. Yay, 12 years. And before that, I was a journalist and critic. And I've worked in journalism since the 1990s, which I need to stop admitting publicly because that's a long time. The Darkwater Project creates and participates in the construction of an anti-racist American art history by revealing and interrogating historical American art's role in the construction of white supremacy. I formed Darkwater with Dr. Kelly Morgan after she left the Indianapolis Museum of Art. After we started Darkwater and put together this program, in fact, Kelly accepted a job founding the curatorial studies program at Tufts, which is where you can find here now. I commend anyone to that program. And I run Darkwater now with help from an advisory board. Darkwater specifically investigates how American art produced during the long 19th century, from the 1770 Boston Massacre to the National Harlem Renaissance, played an important role in making whiteness central to American citizenship. Darkwater is particularly interested in migrating ideas and research gleaned from the fields of whiteness studies, citizenship studies, and genocide studies into the study and presentation of historical American art. This week, we're talking about this book, Matthew Frye Jacobson's enormously influential Whiteness of a Different Color. The book opens with the specific political context detailing why defining whiteness was politically and legally imperative for early European and, of course, almost entirely Anglo-Americans. And that is the Constitution, which was written in 1787, ratified in 1788, and which prompted the Confederation Congress to set March 1789 as when the United States would begin operating under this new document. The Constitution, as Jacobson points out, included a number of clauses that effectively required early federal legislation There is this clause in Article 1, which I guess there are two that are germane. This clause in Article 1 that calls on Congress to define naturalization and who could become United States residents. Remember, citizenship until well into the 20th century is defined by individual states. And secondly, defining who might or who would be required to serve in a federal armed force, the duties of which are defined here: to provide for calling for the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Oh, that word, insurrections. Note that the first law to define racialized legal and political privilege in the United States was the United States' first naturalization law, passed in 1790 and signed into law by George Washington, of course. The law defined naturalized belonging was limited to, quote, free white persons. You can see it here early up in the bill. This is the only surviving document from the writing and passage of the naturalization law. And then note also how the bill underscores how, of course, citizenship was a state and not a federal matter. That the only federal interest at this point was fulfilling the Constitution's requirement that Congress define a naturalization process, and that Congress chose to do that with a racialized binary. Jacobson underscores in the book, and repeatedly, in fact, that as Congress considered this bill in 1790, there was no debate about defining white, about who counted, air quotes, as white. To Congress in 1790, it was extremely obvious. People were white or people who were black nor natives. As a zillion scholars have pointed out for over a century, and as we've addressed previously in this colloquium, Congress enforced a grossly false binary that, among other things, pretended that white enslavers had not raped women that they enslaved, forcing them into pregnancy and childbirth. We should understand that the construct in this legislation at the core of the earliest definition of American is a look-away fiction. And before we accept this as an inevitability, I want to note that other American nations and colonies that were born from European imperialism rejected the false binary that the United States adopted, and that their art was central to their constructions. I'm thinking of, for example, 18th century casta paintings made in the Spanish Americas in the second half of the 18th century, exactly concurrent with when the United States Congress is creating its false binary. There is a lot of work, both scholarship and hopefully scholarship migrated into exhibition practice, to be done in future years, comparing, contrasting, and understanding the ways in which art participated across the Americas in racialization. Scholars of Spanish colonial art have done a great job of this, no one more so than the great Ilona Katsu at LACMA. Personally, I'm particularly interested in the Far West and the Intermountain West, and whether casta constructions and art of those constructions were present and influential within the modern day states, territories of California, Arizona, and New Mexico. Back to the US Congress. In the years right after the ratification of our Constitution, Jacobson's second momentous political event that establishes racialization as core to United States legal constructions is the Second Militia Act, which defines who is expected to participate in the armed defense of the new nation. Again, Congress defines Americans as eligible for militia service as white male citizens. This is the first federal code book on your screen. White male citizens of the respective states. Again, a reference to how states determine citizenship and not the federal government. So why is this second restriction of American belonging racialized? Jacobson, in explaining it, paraphrases the great federal judge and scholar Leon Higginbotham Jr. When he writes, quote, "As scholars like Higginbotham have said, in practice, the idea of citizenship had become thoroughly entwined with the idea of whiteness, and of course maleness, because what a citizen really was at bottom was someone who could help put down a slave rebellion or participate in Indian wars. The very notion of providing for the common defense was inherently racial in the context of slaveholding on one hand and frontier settlement on the other. The upshot of these two early and nation-defining pieces of federal legislation is to devote the United States to making racializing a part of every law, every treaty, and darn near every federal process until well into the 20th century, and really, in many ways, into the present, as we've seen in the Supreme Court in just the last few weeks. All of this becomes especially important as European immigration to the United States picks up in the 1830s and then explodes in the 1840s. Of course, this was far from the first immigration boom in the United States. The US permitted the forced immigration of Africans until 1808, and of course, we know that the transatlantic enslavement trade continued thereafter as well, or afterward as well. Jacobson explains how this influx of Europeans forced the United States to reconsider what white people were, and I quote, 15 years later, beginning with the massive influx of highly undesirable but nonetheless white persons from Ireland, whiteness was subject to new interpretations. The period of mass European immigration from the 1840s to the restrictive legislation of 1924, that's the Johnson-Reed Act, witnessed a fracturing of whiteness into a hierarchy of plural and pseudo-scientifically determined white races. We discussed the pseudoscience behind all this in a couple of the previous sessions. Vigorous debate ensued over which of these was truly, quote, fit for self-government in the good old Anglo-Saxon sense. Finally, in the 1920s and after, partly because the crisis of over-inclusive whiteness had been solved by restrictive legislation and partly in response to a new racial alchemy generated by African-American migrations to the North and far West, whiteness was reconsolidated. The late 19th century's probationary white groups were now remade and granted the scientific stamp or pseudo-scientific stamp of authenticity as the unitary Caucasian race. An earlier era's Celts, Slavs, Hebrews, Iberics, and Saracens, among others, had become the Caucasians so familiar to our own visual economy and racial lexicon. When I went and renewed my driver's license here in North Carolina a few months ago, the state required me to define my race, and the choice it gave me, one of the choices it gave me was not white, it was Caucasian. I passed. Furthermore, as the 19th century, the geographic enormity of the nation and regional difference came to bear as well. Jacobson also writes, quote, an Irish immigrant in 1877 could be a despised Celt in Boston, a threat to the Republic, and yet a solid member of the Order of Caucasians for the Extermination of the Chinamen in San Francisco, which was the name of an actual group, gallantly defending US shores in an invasion of Mongolians. From the third paragraph of Jacobson's introduction to the book, he makes clear or emphasizes that cultural production was fundamental to the construction of racialism adopted by United States political and legal systems. We've seen this idea before in the very first colloquium session. I mentioned several times Roger Smith's great book, Civic Ideals. Smith, throughout his extremely long book, I think it's 800 pages, repeatedly notes how laws and legal opinions from judges come not from the courts and legislatures down and then influence culture, but that culture, that the political and legal constructs are responding to what's in the culture. And Jacobson absolutely accepts that construct as well. For the purposes of brevity, so I noticed how across Jacobson's book, he refers to American fiction novels over and over and over again. So for the purposes of brevity, I restricted examples of such to a single slide. I think there are 15 examples here. Even though listing these 15 novels got me less than a third of the way through Jacobson's book. They include novels by Philip Roth and Frank Norris, Sinclair Lewis, William Faulkner, and so on. I will not read this slide. But while we're here, I will note that Jacobson opens his first full chapter of his book with examples from Hugh Henry Brackenridge's 1792 to 1815 novel, Modern Chivalry. It was kind of published in 4 parts, published and revised across 4 parts, in which a main character is an Irish immigrant who, over the course of the novel, is welcomed into Americanness in part by his demonstrated bigotry toward Native Americans. Indeed, Brackenridge introduces this character, his name is Teague O'Reilly, as an Aboriginal Irish, quote, Aboriginal Irish, and contrasts O'Regan with Aboriginal North Americans. Brackenridge lived the history he satirizes in Modern Chivalry. He was a Scottish immigrant to Susquehannock land along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, land that was colonized mostly by Scots-Irish and German immigrants at a time when it was by no means clear that such immigrants would be included within what would become the American Federal Project in the 1780s and 90s, or Pennsylvania's eventual definition of citizenship. Brackenridge, who would go on to found what became the University of Pittsburgh and today's Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which still publishes, was well positioned to know how the question of whiteness and belonging was up for debate. When he ran for Congress in the 1790s, he lost, and he was defeated by old friend Albert Gallatin, whom we've met previously in this colloquium. Gallatin considered his own whiteness to be under question, so much so that at Pennsylvania's Constitutional Convention, he argued that Pennsylvania's Constitution should not use the word white as a precondition for citizenship. Scholars have generally taken that as an indication that Gallatin, who knew he was a dark-skinned Swiss American, was worried about whether or not he would qualify. Not for the first time today, we have the opportunity to consider how the artistic representation of skin tone impacts American constructions. So speaking of these 2 revealing Stuart portraits, this might be the most important point Jacobson raises in the book, the point from which the book around which the book revolves. Quote, the contending forces of class formation and racial formation in the American political culture produced, quote, the institutionalization of a racial order that drew a color line around rather than within Europe. True enough, and a useful corrective to those who would disavow their whiteness even while they live lives predicated upon its privileges. But between the 1840s and the 1920s, it was not altogether clear just where that line ultimately would be drawn. That quote, Jacobson's quote about the institutionalization of a racial order comes from a textbook called Racial Formation in the United States. It is either the most used American textbook about the development of US citizenship in American colleges and universities, most. This point about it not being altogether clear just where that line ultimately would be drawn is what we'll be spending the rest of today looking at, and how it bounces across American art and how American art was involved in that. I've spent a lot of time in the 19th century in this colloquium because I've spent the last decade writing books about the 19th century. So today I'm going to make sure we look at the 20th century and 20th century art. So let's zip into the early part of the 20th century and to Lothrop Stoddard, a Harvard-trained historian and political scientist, an author, and a Klansman, as well as perhaps the leading public intellectual eugenicist of his time. Jacobson quotes Stoddard writing in 1924, quote, "Race is what people physically really are. Nationality is what people politically think they are," end quote. Hence, when the Senate Commission on Immigration reported in 1911 that Poles are darker than Lithuanians and lighter than the average Russian, for instance, this was a statement of what the Poles physically really are. Note 2 things here. One, we're seeing a dissolving of the black-white binary in response to immigration. And secondly, that white supremacists have answers to the dissolution of that binary. Here is Stoddard's own analysis and map from his book, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. a top-selling book of the 1920s, unless you think that that was some rogue title, or that the book is some rogue book. Here is a quote from the fawning New York Times review. Quote, Lothrop Stoddard evokes a new peril, that of an eventual submersion beneath vast waves of yellow men, brown men, black men, and red men, whom the Nordics have hitherto dominated, with Bolshevism menacing us on one hand and race extinction through warfare on the other. Many people are not unlikely to give Stoddard's book respectful consideration. I'm sure Stoddard considered this map an argument in favor of his arguments. You see how he defines his use of colors across the map. But if we note the many places that were not uniformly, air quotes, white or uniformly yellow or brown, Stoddard uses colors that he does not include in his chart. His confusion, his flummoxedness, if that's a word, is belied and undercut by his own map. Anyway, back to skin tone and racialization in American art. Let's look at Robert Henry. Robert Henry's role in the construction of racialization in the United States is one of the very few of these art histories that Americanists have delved into. So I'd like to shout out Derek Cartwright's 2014 Robert Henry's California Portraits, Realism, Race, and Region, 1914 to 1925, which debuted at the Laguna Art Museum in Laguna Beach and traveled to the San Jose Museum of Art in 2014. Cartwright now teaches and runs the galleries at the University of San Diego, and he is the head of curatorial affairs for the Timken Museum in San Diego. The first painting I've called up is Robert Henry's Chinese Lady from 1940 at the Milwaukee Art Museum. Scholars understand the title as Henry's. He does not give her a name. She is just a type, Chinese Lady. As we look at this portrait, I always think about how in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the most common slur that people culturally and politically constructed into privilege use to define immigrants is greaser. It is a slur born from the fact that immigrants often did manual labor with their hands, and that they sweated. And I think throughout Henry's many immigrant portraits, he paints immigrants, including immigrant children, as having bright and shiny skin, as being, as the slur goes, greasers. Here's for comparison, a portrait of a young man of privilege, Stephen Green. If you look at Henry's portraits from these same years, roughly these same years, of people constructed into whiteness, you will not find the same way of treating skin. I should note also that child labor is legal in this era. And hence the greaser slur can be and was applied to children. Henry is really interested in skin tone across lots of his work. In fact, here's the Spanish Gypsy from 1912 at the Met, which might be said to be a painting primarily about skin tone. And at the far right is another painting from the Met, Henry's Masquerade Dress of 1911, which is a painting of his wife. The question of fitness for participation in self-government, which is a phrase I think Jacobson uses something like 70 times across his 300 pages. It's a phrase really common in all of these books we've been reading in the colloquium. The question of the fitness, of the inherent fitness for participation in self-government lies beneath these constructions, not only in 1790, but still here in the 20th century. And here in this quote, Jacobson raises that issue within the context of early 20th century discourse. Quote, the frankness with which the courts asserted the relationship between race on the one hand and, quote, fitness for self-government on the other is striking, at once articulating and sustaining the prejudices of the lawmakers of 1790, one judge explains in 1921, and Jacobson quotes the judge, quote, It is obvious that the objection on the part of Congress to admitting Asians to citizenship is not due to color as color, but only to color as an evidence of a type of civilization which it characterizes. The yellow or brown racial color is the hallmark of Oriental despotisms. It was deemed that the subjects of these despotisms, with their fixed and ingrained pride in the type of their civilization, were not fitted and suited to make for the success of a republican form of government. Hence, they were denied citizenship. Note that constructions such as Lothrop Stoddard's are migrating into American law, and that geographical origin and racial color matters. So let's look at some art involved in and engaged with this discourse. These are two pictures of Diego Rivera's 1930-31 murals for the Pacific Stock Exchange in San Francisco, which at the time was the most important commercial site west of Chicago, and perhaps by 1930, the most important commercial site outside of New York. I've given us two pictures here because probably not very many of us have been into the City Club in San Francisco where the Rivera remains to this day. The mural is surrounded by this kind of ochre, yellow, orangish stone, and it faces a window, as you can kind of tell here with this reflection, and it's under fluorescent lighting. I imagine it's really hard to represent the colors of the mural art in photographs, so I thought I'd give us two. Rivera was recommended for this commission by the California-based sculptor Ralph Stackpole. Stackpole and Rivera met in Paris when Stackpole was a student in the studio of a sculptor named Antonin Merci, who we'll see again in a little bit. But back to Rivera, this is the major section of his mural for the Pacific Stock Exchange. It's called Allegory of California. Rivera's first design for the mural is shown here on the left-hand side of your screen. So far as I know, and I should note that I have not seen the Rivera show that recently opened at SF MoMA, and I have not seen its catalog, so I don't know if it addresses any of this. I'm sorry. But so far as I know, we do not have contemporary textual documents that detail Rivera's design for the Stock Exchange mural. Note this figure here. Scholars have described this figure as referencing Mexican identity, to use the phrase in a 2000 LACMA catalog, but other scholars have argued it's Rivera's evocation of an obviously unspecific Native American woman. This, if it was a Native American woman, that would have been a pretty big deal. Before John C. Fremont's 1846 instigation of California genocide, California had the largest and most diverse indigenous population in North America. If Rivera is representing a Native woman, his original design might be understood to have suggested that California make an address of its past central to its future, which is represented elsewhere in the mural: oil, engineering, science, aviation, agriculture, and so on. And note also that this drawing is partially squared, so Rivera was probably thought he was going forward with this. I don't know what happened next, but and none of the scholarship around this Rivera addresses it. But the Stock Exchange seems to have rejected this particular figure. So Rivera next offered this drawing at the Tate as a proposal for the replacement of the primary figure. The drawing shows tennis champion and East Bay resident Helen Wills Moody. The year Rivera made this drawing, Moody won Roland Garros and Wimbledon, which might be why it's at the Tate. The Stock Exchange thought Moody was too direct a reference to a single individual in the immediate present, and told Rivera to replace her, which he sort of did, barely. Across Rivera's murals and the Stock Exchange's apparent response to his designs, we see the racial order being formed or mandated in real time. I would add that Stackpole's sculptures, which are on the outside of the Stock Exchange building and on it as friezes, do much of this same work. I don't have images of them good enough to show. I'm sorry about that. Last time I was in San Francisco, or at least last time I was in that part, the building was being turned into an Equinox gym, which is what it is now. And so I couldn't take pictures of shareable quality, shall we say. So let's think back to Jacobson's emphasis on how American political, legal, and cultural spheres conspired to create a racial order that drew a color line around rather than within Europe. A key way this happened was with public art, with monumental sculpture placed in prominent places within American cities. And for this part of the story, let's look at and indeed build from Monument Lab's recent National Monument Audit, released a year ago last week, a document which is primarily an argument for address, but which I am taking here and probably in some other work as a call for historical interrogation. Note in the top 50 people represented in American United States public monuments, 2 of the top 22 figures are Poles, and there are many prominent Catholic historical figures, St. Francis of Assisi, Junipero Serra, and so on. We're going to focus specifically on the Poles. Between roughly 1870 and World War I, roughly 2.2 million Poles emigrated to the United States. They primarily moved to New York, and also to Buffalo, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. Their presence here on Monument Lab's list reminds us of the intense anti-Catholicism of the American 18th, 19th, and first 2/3 of the 20th centuries. The question, as earlier, was whether Catholics had the inherent capacity to participate in Republican self-government, or if they were, to use the language of the day, papists who blindly did whatever a pope told them. Or if they were Jewish, as many Polish immigrants were, if Jews had the inherent capacity to participate in self-government. Because of anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism in particular, Poles were not generally active in US electoral politics in the late 19th and early 20th century. They could, however, participate in the cultural commons through the commissioning and installation of sculpture, monuments to historical figures who were Polish American. And as these figures in Monument Lab's accounting make clear, they sure did. Number 7 on Monument Lab's list, Casimir Pulaski with 51 public monuments. Number 22, Thaddeus Kukushko with 22. He's at 22 on the list with 22 monuments. I'm going to show just 2 of those. Both are by Kazimierz Chudzinski, the leading Polish-American sculptor of the first decade of the 20th century. Chudzinski lived in Buffalo from about 1903 to 1910, at which point he returned to Poland, where he became arguably the country's leading sculptor. Made the 2 most prominent and significant sculptures honoring Polish contributions to the 18th century American independence movement. The Pulaski Monument, shown here on your screen, is in Washington, D.C. It's more or less just outside the Willard Hotel and the Treasury Department. We have here a photograph of the sculpture shortly after its installation. The area in which it is sited is now called Freedom Plaza. It's kind of a postmodern park, kind of an odd triangular shape, right near the White House Visitor Center. Pulaski was a general in the Continental Army. He is credited with having saved George Washington's life at the Battle of the Brandywine, and he is quite often considered the father of the American cavalry. The Kukushko sculpture was originally made for and installed in the Polish neighborhood of Humboldt Park in Chicago before it was relocated to a more prominent site along Lake Michigan between the Shedd Aquarium and Adler Planetarium. Kukushko also fought in the Revolutionary War, first under Horatio Gates in New York State, and later in theaters in the Carolinas. Note that the Kukushko monument in particular is informed not only by the famed equestrian sculpture of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, but I think particularly also by Thomas Crawford's Virginia-Washington Monument, which is right outside the State House, which is called the White House, in downtown Richmond. This Crawford, which I think we've seen before in the colloquium. I don't remember if I showed that slide or if I deleted it. But it is an engagement with how America is extending and improving upon Roman republicanism as part of that civilization moving westward story. It was installed in Richmond in 1857, 58, depending on how you count it. The sculptures further down from this Crawford sculpture of Washington on a horse were installed later on, including after the Civil War. When Jefferson Davis was inaugurated for the second time, he was inaugurated under this sculpture, and this sculpture is on the Confederate seal. This question of republicanism and whose it was in Civil War America was a big deal. For Northerners, they were the true defenders of republicanism because republicanism meant self-government and human rights. And for Southerners, Republican was about property rights. Finally, before taking any questions, I want to share what might be the most art historically significant white supremacist sculpture and monument in the United States. But let me set it up a little bit with this reminder that while the definition of who counted as white was the subject of intense legal, political, and cultural discourse, the originalist understanding of who was white was always taken for granted by political and legal elites. In sculptures offered as monuments, the affirmation of traditional originalist constructions of whiteness was an argument for not only the status quo, but for a maintenance of white supremacy, especially when that sculpture was installed during the Second Klan era at what might have been the most geopolitically charged Civil War site in Charleston, South Carolina. That sculpture is this one, Herman Atkins McNeil's Confederate Defenders of Charleston. I suspect most of you know who Herman Atkins McNeil was at the very end of the 19th century, in the first few decades of the 20th. He was one of the 2 or 3 leading, what you might call institutionalist sculptors of the United States. His sculptures were commissioned by 8 or 10 or 12 US states for their state houses or capitals, state capitals. He designed the sculpture and the sculpture program for the Connecticut state capitol when William McKinley was assassinated. It is McNeil who the state of Ohio commissioned to create a monumental sculpture of McKinley, which still stands in front of that Thomas Cole designed State House. McNeil was, he lived between Boston and New York. He was as mainstream and institutionalist as it got. We should not miss that. Well, I'll come to that in a moment. So this is McNeil's Confederate Defenders of Charleston. Confederate Defenders was installed in 1930. It is Charleston's answer to this sculpture. See, remember him? His Robert E. Lee Monument, which was installed on Monument Avenue on the edge of an expanding Richmond, Virginia in 1890. Mercy was recommended for this commission by none other than Augustus St. Gaudens. David Blight, the great scholar of Civil War and after mid-19th century America, wrote that, quote, the unveiling of the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond on Memorial Day, 1890, marked the entry of the lost cause into the national mainstream. The lost cause had essentially effectively been born in Charleston. The Lee Monument in Richmond was the idea going public, coming outside the South, even though it was in Richmond, in a big way. Note that it builds on some of the same cultural terrain that Thomas Crawford used in his Washington Monument just a couple miles away. The Lee Monument prompts a flurry of neo-Confederate monuments across the South, lost cause monuments, some of which were sculptures, some of which were stained glass windows in churches and memorial chapels, and so on. Confederate defenders. So where is it? Here is the closest I could find to 1929 map of Charleston. This is where the sculpture is sited, on the very southern tip of the peninsula on which Charleston sits. I am not making this up. It sits on a site called White Point Garden. 3.3 miles away is Fort Sumter. The two defenders are gazing out from White Point Garden directly at Fort Sumter. I'm not going to, there's a list of some of the key elements of the sculpture. I'm not going to go through all of them, certainly. But I will note this. There are two sets of visual, not sure what the word is, tropes that the sculpture engages, extends, and uses as part of its extension of lost cause ideology. One is a set of Anglo-Saxonist imagery, and the other is a set of Roman imagery that references the debate over who was the true inheritor of Roman republicanism in the 1850s and 60s, part of a debate that was had across the United States that I referenced earlier. I'm just going to show a couple examples of that imagery, or highlight a couple examples of that imagery as we go forward here. There's our the Confederate defenders. The pose, especially of the lower body of McNeill's Confederate defender, is taken directly from the Apollo Belvedere. The contrapposto pose, of course. Note the feet here. And I tried to include a picture earlier of giving a sense of the torquing movement of the sculpture. I'm sorry, that one's in the shadow. I have pictures of it in the sun, but it just kind of gets washed out by the morning sun. I don't remember, I don't know if McNeill traveled and saw the Apollo Belvedere, but certainly he, like any other sculptor worth his salt in the early 20th century, would have known of it from prints and photographs, such as this one by Goltzius. The contrapposto pose was increasingly common in American sculpture in the late 19th century. Certainly the Boston-born and raised and schooled McNeill would have known it from Daniel Chester French's famous The Minuteman, which was installed at what is now Minuteman National Historic Park in Lincoln and Concord, Mass. There we go. There are lots of references to Rome across the sculpture. The Confederate defender, the male figure, has, for example, a Caesar haircut, which is somewhat highlighted by patination. If I was up on a lift, I could show that a little better. But also, he's wearing Legionnaire's sandals. And the gown, the dress of the muse-like figure is clearly borrowing from Roman and Greek statuary, which was extremely common across American sculpture in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially as America was arguing for the renewal of its republicanism in the wake of the Civil War. By the way, Daniel Chester French was one of McNeill's very best friends. I apologize for this picture on the right. I was doing the best I could. I think what we're seeing here are lilies, martyrs lilies, fleur-de-lis. I can't swear these are lilies. This section of the sculpture is heavily patinated. And it's really hard to see, especially from about 6 feet below. But what I think we're seeing here is a migration of kind of the reference to martyrs lilies of European art, which in the 1860s rush into American art in paintings such as Eastman Johnson's Gathering Lilies, which is kind of a memorial to those lost in the Civil War. And I think this is my last slide. Nope, it's not. 2 more slides. McNeill is best known today not only for those monumental sculptures in state houses and in parks across the United States, including in downtown Portland, but he's best known for his design of what by some accounts is the most popular American coin of the 20th century, the Standing Liberty Quarter. In McNeill's first design for the Standing Liberty Quarter, the female Liberty figure was topless. People objected, and so McNeill redesigned the quarter to clothe her with mail, what is commonly called chainmail, which he had first rolled out in his Confederate Defenders of Charleston. The female figure is wearing here is of a particular Anglo-Saxon design. It is Anglo-Saxon mail. What is inspiring the defender of Charleston, the male defender of Charleston, is his Anglo-Saxon heritage. In the late 1920s, both in the United States and in Germany, he says pointedly, Nordic peoples were being welcomed into the construction of Anglo-Saxonism. Anglo-Saxonism was increasingly becoming not only Anglo, English, and Saxon German, but Scandinavians, Nordics were being welcomed in. The sword that the male Confederate defender is carrying is a particular kind of short sword, sometimes called a Viking short sword. There is an example of this exact kind of sword in the United States. It's at the Worcester Art Museum. They acquired it, I think, just last year or in 2020, and haven't shot it yet. So I'm afraid I don't have an image of it. I have images of examples from the National Museum of Denmark here. And you're saying, oh, but this sword is slightly longer than the sword the Confederate defender is holding. You can't quite tell from my unprofessional photograph, sorry about that. But if this sword was any longer, you would not see the female figure standing below it. The sword would block her face. But I think that's what McNeill is doing here. And I think that's my last slide. So let me just pause to see if anyone has questions or comments. If any of you do, I would be delighted to take them. William Blake, are you trying to ask a question? If you are, I will ask you to unmute. I'm getting a... Maybe not. I don't see any questions in the chat. Let me note before wrapping up, next week is the 6th and final of these colloquia. We will be reading this book, Tyler Stovall's White Freedom, which I think is at $12 for the Kindle version on Amazon right now, and maybe $13 for the paperback version, with the exception of one slightly odd chapter on Peter Pan. Yes, really? It's an absolutely terrific book. I mean, just an absolute thrilling book, the perfect book with which to conclude this colloquium. It's zippily written. Stovall is the only one of our 6 authors who writes about art, who includes art within his narrative. I think that's because Stovall, who passed away just after this book was published, was a scholar of French liberty movements and transatlantic republicanism. And he understood how important art had been to the construction of French nationalism in the 19th century. So strongly recommended. Can't wait to share this book with you all in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about the book, William Wetmore Story's Great Sculpture Cleopatra. And we do have a question from Martina Tanga. Can we talk a little bit more about the fear that non-white people could not be trusted to vote for the Republic? Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I think it's, if we go back to this list that Monument Lab had in its audit, I think that is, I think we're seeing that fear in trying to share this with you, sorry. There we go. I think we're seeing that fear in real time. I think that's why we are seeing so many figures who were prominent within so-called hyphenated Americanisms of the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century on this list. First of all, I guess I should also note that this list does not include allegorical figures or abstracted or other representative figures, only people who can clearly be identified. And I remember when I showed this to my father a year ago, he said the list included far fewer presidents than he would have expected. And I think that's right. I think you have I think as Monument Lab clearly understands, you have a definition of who can be trusted, air quotes, playing out in real time in American public space through monument culture. I think that from as a result of Kennedy's election, and I think probably most of the people in this colloquium grew up in a Kennedy and after America. There were serious doubts that Kennedy could be elected because of this question about whether or not a Catholic president could be trusted to have America's priorities first and not the Vatican's. I think that's some of what's behind not only the Junipero Serra monuments in sites across California, but in the debate over those Serra monuments over the last 5 years. It must be said that I don't know that more than 1 or 2 of those Serra monuments is art historically significant, which is why I didn't show any. But the Catholic Church in California has come out hard against the many Californians, including, I think, the governor, who have argued for the removal of Serra monuments because of Serra's role in the California genocide. Or maybe the pre-American portion of the pre-United States portion of the California genocide. It's a different genocide. Estimates are that the Spanish imperial and mission and presidio construction between San Diego and San Francisco and a little bit north of San Francisco introduced disease, slavery, and violence so thoroughly that the Spanish colonial processes caused a decline of perhaps 30 or 40% of the California indigenous population from 1770 until the 1840s. Those numbers are really squishy, scholars. I mean, it's not like there was a census of indigenous Californians taken in 1769 before the Spanish come up through Baja California. But the Serra monuments are very much contested within California, and many have been removed. Yeah, I think that we have Elise Nelson. Hi, Elise. Asking me if I could speak a bit more about the absorption of Nordics into the idea of Anglo-Saxon, and if this coincided with the immigration of Scandinavians to the US. And Elise notes she's thinking about the large populations in the Midwest. Yes, it did. In short, not just in the Northwest, not just in the Midwest, but in the Northwest as well, in Washington State and Seattle, Ballard neighborhood, and so on. There have been scholars, and I wish I was more prepared to speak on this, who have argued that Germany's Nazi Party takes its embrace of Nordic addition to Anglo-Saxonism from the American embrace of Nordics into Anglo-Saxonism. There have been several books about this in just the last decade. Susan Neiman's, I'm looking over my shoulder for the title, which is too small on the spine of the book for me to read from here. But there have been several books on that. I will get titles and share them in 2 weeks. There's a book about Hitler and Los Angeles, and how Los Angeles intellectualism and Hollywood culture were influential on Nazi constructions. There's Susan Neiman's book, and a couple of others that detail this. Nurit Pasner asks a question from the Supreme Court this week. The defense did not have an answer I am not sure which case that is. Affirmative action, perhaps. I am not completely up to date on that. I mean, I know what happened. I know how the argument went, but I am not anywhere near enough of a legal historian to be able to answer that. Except to note that the question of citizenship and belonging and privilege is very much still debated, and that these constructions from 1790 and from subsequent naturalization and immigration acts, including the Chinese Exclusion Act and Reed-Johnson, are very much with us. Leslie Shipley asks me if I could talk a little bit more about Diego Rivera and why I selected it for today, because he's an interesting choice in this context. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Thank you. The rest of the question is, would Rivera himself have been viewed as white, or did it not really matter as long as he followed his patron's desires? So one of the reasons I chose the Rivera, if not the major reason, is Jacobson writes about drawing a line around Europe in terms of the definition of whiteness, which is true and certainly happened, but that doesn't mean that the constructions that were applied to Romanians or Serbians or Poles were only applied to Europeans. And so I wanted to underscore that even though Jacobson is specifically writing about Europeans being welcomed into whiteness, that it was not only Europeans who were considered, who were interested in such, and that the constructions of adding new potential members, participants in the privileges of whiteness, that those constructions, especially in the far West, went beyond Europeans. Jacobson's book is really good. It's really, really, really good. But in terms of the far West, I'm an Easterner, but I'm a native Californian, and I often find that a lot of these histories give short shrift to the West. Jacobson does write about Asian Americans and a little bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act and its 5-decade-long aftermath, 7-decade-long aftermath. But I thought Rivera was a good way at pointing to how the constructs Jacobson examines could be broadened. Would Rivera himself have, I don't think you can argue that Mexican Americans were constructed into whiteness during Rivera's lifetime. I think this is going to get me into trouble, but I think you can argue there's no clearer example than the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art itself. In 1930, SF MoMA was founded in part with a collection by a great patron, Albert Bender, great patron of Mexican American modernism. SF MoMA's founding collection is substantially a collection of Mexican modernism. And I think it could be fairly said that in the 90 years since, that museum has not been as interested in Mexican modernism as it might have been, especially considering its influence on not only American art, but particularly American art in the far West. I think Ralph Stackpole's, for example, his sculptures and friezes at the Pacific Stock Exchange are intensely informed by Mexican modernism. As far as Rivera and his engagement with patrons, there's been a lot of scholarship on that over the years. Leah Dickerman did a great show at MoMA about a decade ago. I think the book's actually behind me because I was looking at it for this. Nope, it's not behind me. But Leah Dickerman did a great show on Rivera and his relationship with the Rockefellers and his work at Rock Center at MoMA about a decade ago. As I recall, that show was produced when MoMA was in its producing extravagant exhibition websites period. And so I imagine that's still findable on their website. Last call for questions. Martina Tanga writes, the self-governance issue is really helpful to me. I think what she's referring to is the question of whether or not certain peoples had an capacity, magic, for self-government. She says that's really helpful to her as I was looking at how Americans viewed Italians in the 19th century and how they disparaged contemporary Italians while valuing Italian history. And it's because they seemed very anti-progressive to Americans when Italy unified and established the monarchy. Yeah, I mean, Southern Italians were, there's been a whole lot of scholarship on Southern Italians, particularly in New York City, the Ellis Island experience. And skin tone is absolutely a part of that scholarship. I am sometimes jealous of Easterners. There is a whole lot more scholarship on European peoples who, is this fair to say? Yeah, I think it's fair to say. On European peoples who entered the United States through the East Coast immigration facilities, such as Ellis Island, than there is on the far West. An exception in a different way is May and Guy's fabulous recent National Book Award winning book on Chinese immigration and the gold rush, and not just the American gold rush, but Chinese immigration or emigration out of China and gold rushes around the globe. It's a fascinating book. And of course, it's not only Chinese who are coming into California, although it was in the 1870s, 1860s anyway. Japanese start coming in the 1870s. And then, of course, there's Filipino immigration that comes along a little bit later as part of all kinds of things, including American imperialism continuing to move west out of California and across the Pacific. I wish we could do more than 6 books on all this, but there are a whole lot of books on the construction of specific European people from specific European nations coming to the United States, and how and when they were constructed into whiteness. Edward Bateman asks, does there seem to be a point where black and white as racial labels began to be extended, at least metaphorically, to use of pigments and objects in art? I mean, I think those Henry portraits are certainly a place to look, right? Henry's skin tones are something, and not just his. If you compare his paintings of Irish or Irish Americans to his paintings of Native Americans or immigrants, boy, there's specificity there. I tried to find a Chira Abada portrait, either actual or allegorical, to show with Henry's Chinese lady from Milwaukee, and I couldn't find one where the image was good enough that you could really see it. But I think there is a Chira Abada at the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento. They acquired it just a couple years ago. And there is an image of it on the Crocker's collection website. It's just not big enough to be shareable on a Zoom. And I think that you see real ideology in the Henry when compared with the Abada. There was a major Abada show, I think 2 or 3 years ago. We featured it on the Modern Art Notes podcast. It is a frustration to me that a lot of Asian American art of the late 19th and first half of the 20th century in American Art Museum collections, particularly in the far West, has not been digitized, even as, say, Diego Rivera's or Jackson Pollock's have been. I can't overstate how valuable the work Elisa Pitchmarn Alexander and Marcy Kwan are doing at Stanford in the Asian American Art Initiative across Stanford, both in the art history department and at the Cantor. Margie Conrad asks, Ray, Henry and palette, what does this mean for Maratha color theory that Henry and others employed? Good question. I don't know. I just don't know. Henry, I think Henry's, I think that Derek Cartwright show I cited earlier, I think it had 14 or 12 paintings in it. I think there's a lot more work for Americanists to do there. I hope they do, because I'd learn a lot from it. And Lord knows I'm a little stuck in the 19th century. At least 19th century ideology, even when I do get into the 20th century. Last call for questions. Okie dokie. Thanks, everybody. Last call reminder, White Freedom, Tyler Stovall, 2 weeks, 6th of 6 sessions. The video from today will be up on the Darkwater Project's YouTube channel, probably on Sunday. Just really kind of depends on how quickly Zoom and YouTube process the audio or the video into HD. And on Monday afternoon, around 4 or 5 p.m. Eastern time, the audio will be on the Modern Art Notes podcast feed, along with this week's show, which will feature Emily Braun talking about Cubism and Trompe l'oeil at a certain museum on the Upper East Side, New York, and Mark Steinmetz from an exhibition at the Georgia Museum of Art and the 70th anniversary issue of Aperture. Thanks for joining us.